Thank you all again for your questions on Twitter, on Facebook, and on other social media. We've been collecting and collating backstage, and we have a few for each of our speakers. I guess we'll begin with John. John, a couple of people tweeted comments to us about their own experiences of education. One person said that during their experience at Victoria, I don't know whether that was recent or a little more removed in the past, but they appreciated the ways in which Christian values were upheld on campus. Another person commented that as a lifelong teacher, they don't see their task as an educator to give inputs so as to produce outputs. So given these contrasting experiences of being educated and being an educator, what might you observe has changed in our way of approaching education between these two rather positive experiences and something of the more difficult and challenging experience that you related in your talk?
Thanks, Derek. Thanks for those thoughts. I think that part of the challenge currently in higher education, and I can't speak for secondary or primary education, I think that actually the frame is still, certainly at primary level, much fuller in terms of the identity of the learners and what we think we're doing when we're teaching. But I think at university what we're experiencing is an overly narrow invitation, a narrowed identity for learners at universities, even within the possibilities of disciplines. So my background is in the arts and literature, which really requires a large, generous, capacious account of what it means to be human, to make sense of the BA. And a lot of our struggle among BA students of why am I doing what I'm doing and so on, comes from an overly narrow notion of what the good is that we're seeking, I suppose. There's that, and there's also, I think, a question around the way in which we're teaching, which really addresses us as intellects, and abstracts us from where we are learning and from who we're learning with, so that you could do this anywhere. And it's not a kind of learning necessarily that equips us for where we are with who we are. The only other thing I want to say, I think, is that for Christians, I think that we can take that way of learning into our faith. And one way of summarising what I was saying tonight is that there is a difference between knowing about God and knowing God and being known by God. Christianity claims that it's possible to know God and be known by God. And that reality is something that shakes and opens and changes all of the other arenas of life. It's something I've found to be true. It's something I see to be true in the lives of those whom I serve. So, yeah, there's my thoughts there.
Thanks very much, John. Our next question is for Rosemary. We have a comment here that much like the real world, our socially mediated world of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram can likewise become a framework for internal insider reference. In other words, it just becomes an echo chamber. Do you think that's true? And if it is, are there ways in which we can engage these media that open up the echo chamber and maybe give us a first go at being curious about the identities of others more than our own, being open and eager to learn from them?
That's a good question. It's interesting, isn't it, that so many human inventions have two sides to them. They can be used for great good, and they can be used for not so great good. And I think of the Arab Spring and the role that social media played in that particular situation, which alerted a lot of people around the world to various things that were going on in the Middle East that otherwise we wouldn't have known about if we weren't accessing social media. And yet, yeah, it can create an echo chamber for those who want to spread hate or who are caught on a sort of a treadmill of a very narrow conversation that doesn't appreciate others. And I think it's interesting, isn't it, that one of the sites has just been shut down this week from the Charlottesville situation, and yet 3 people have talked about it tonight. It just shows that through social media, people have cared about this situation. What can we do? To be really honest with you, that's a question I'm asking myself. I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son. What do I say to them? How do I teach them to be people who both know how to kind of create a buffer zone for their own protection, while at the same time being curious people about their world? And I'm still thinking about that one. I think, we've got to exercise wisdom about how we use social media, and so therefore how we model our use of it to others. And in the end, it's about conversing with people and trying to keep pressing people. How big is your world out of which you're saying these things or these questions? But in the end, it's going to be quite hard to police that, isn't it? We're going to have to model it ourselves. Sorry, I haven't really answered the question, because as I said, I'm still trying to figure it out myself. And if anyone can tell me what I can tell my 12-year-old and my 9-year-old about how to be good on social media and be forces for good, please let me know.
Thanks very much, Rosemary. Last, we have a pair of questions for Joe about both the identity and the location of the theologian. The first question is this: if the church is the proper place for theology to be executed, not killed, but undertaken. Let me be clear about that. That's a dangling modifier. I need to get out my grammarian's red pen. If the church is the place in which theology is to be undertaken, then why are so many theologians stuck in academic departments at universities and seminaries? That's the first question. And you're not? Well, my guess is that Joe's answer will likewise be not me. But anyhow, the second question is that if indeed all of us as Christians are meant to be theologians, but if theology cares not only to think and talk about God, but to tell the truth about God, how do lay theologians, ordinary Christians, make sure that their thinking and speaking about God isn't just idle chatter, but actually says something meaningful and truthful about God in 2 minutes or less?
I mean, that's real easy. We'll have like 1 minute and 50 left. First, to the notion of the location of theological work. It's probably important for us to remember that it's really only within the past 200 years that theology has been pulled out of the church and into academia. It's really only until, not since, actually Friedrich Schleiermacher is kind of at the leading edge of some of that movement into the academy, that there was a sense that in the early 1800s that theology had to defend its existence by playing by the rules of higher academia. And so in order to show that it is a truly academic discipline, in a kind of a nuanced use of the word, a scientific discipline, using all of the rigor of intellectual pursuit, that in order, and again, at this time, you're starting to get some pushback from naturalism. You're getting pushback against theology as the queen of the sciences, and all of a sudden, it's starting to needing to defend itself as a legitimate intellectual endeavor. And so it begins this transition more and more so into the academy, into the university setting, that this is where theologians are. But that's a transition that doesn't really begin happening until the 1800s. So I would politely say that actually what we need to do is we need to remember where we come from. It's actually getting much more easy in a sense because academic jobs are really competitive and it's really tough to get one. And sometimes people are just, well, actually the advice that I give to people who come to me and ask about getting into theological work and maybe I want to do a PhD, the first thing I'll tell them is I'll remind them that you're going to work in a church. You're going to work in a church, and I hope that that's what you want to do anyways. Because if it's not, we probably have to have a couple of different talks. So that's what I'd say to the first bit, and I've forgotten the second half.
The second bit is several of us said
Yeah.
that it's not just people like us on runways with degrees who are theologians, but all of us in a real and meaningful sense are meant to be theologians. But if theology is meant to be truthful talk about God, how is it that ordinary Christians in their lay theology can work towards truthful and meaningful speech about God, thought about God, action about God?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of things going on with that. One of them is demonstrated value. We spend our time learning and doing things that we think are important. I don't spend time reading about the Buffalo Bills American football team in the least.
Not important.
No, but like we do the things that are important to us. And so there's a sense, and frankly, an evening like this, I put this together to be able to start a conversation about the demonstrated importance about careful theological conversation. To get that kind of a conversation going in a lay level, that it is remarkably important, because theological crises don't just come up in Charlottesville. They're actually going on in our places, and we need to be able to have that. Part of it's also then a cultural issue. You can think about Calvin's Geneva was fairly famous for having, well, for a lot of reasons, but one of them being the theological erudition of the laity. This was a remarkably well-informed laity because the teachers of the church were teaching the church. And when you have, maybe there's those two things going on together, those who see themselves as having a principally vocational calling to the church, to then be able to go and to be freed to teach the church. And then as that happens, the laity, all us common folk also say and recognize the significance of that truthful talk. And they build off of one another, and over time that grows. And you have a culture of theological competency. Not everybody's going to be a doctor of the church. Not everybody should be. But we should probably all be able to be literate and to be competent, because tragedy comes. And if we're not equipped, we get run over. Thanks.
Please join me one more time in thanking our second set of speakers.